"Take off the wedding dress," the Duke of Garrow said, and watched the color drain out of his bride's face. "Forgive me. That was badly done, and I did it badly on purpose, because there is no soft way to tell a woman on her wedding morning that this marriage is not about love." Alaric Ravensworth had rehearsed the speech for 3 days on horseback across the Garrow fens, and every version of it had sounded better than this one. Cordelia Ainsworth stood in the middle of his study in ivory silk that had been cut down from her mother's gown and let out again at the seams, her gloved hands folded, her chin level. The chapel bells had stopped ringing 4 minutes ago. There was still a grain of rice caught in the lace at her shoulder. "You will oblige me," she said, "by finishing the sentence." "There is nothing improper in it." He heard how stiff his own voice was and could not soften it. "I mean that you should put on something you can walk in. Wool. Boots, if you have them. Because before you spend a single night under this roof, you are going to see exactly what you have bought with your mourning, and I will not have you looking at it dressed as a bride at a bargain." For a moment she only studied him. Then something in her shoulders let go by a fraction of an inch, and he understood, with an unpleasant lurch, what she had thought he meant. He turned at once to the window and gave her the courtesy of his back. "Your rooms are the green suite at the east end," he said to the glass. "The key is in the lock on the inside. There is a bolt as well. No one enters those rooms without your leave, not a maid, not the housekeeper, not me. If I have anything to say to you, I will say it in a room with a door standing open, or I will write it down. Do you understand me, madam?" "I understand you." Her voice had changed. "Half an hour, your grace, I have boots." She had boots, and a gray walking dress with a mendied cuff, and she was down the great stair in 26 minutes, which he noted because he had been counting. The gig was waiting. He drove it himself. He always drove himself. The tenants had learned to know the sound of that particular wheel on the causeway and to come out of their doors when they heard it, and he had not yet decided whether that pleased him or shamed him. Cordelia sat beside him with her hands in her lap and did not fill the silence with talk, which he had not expected and could not, at first, account for. 2 miles out the hedges gave way, and the fen opened flat, silver, enormous, a country of water pretending to be land. Reed beds stood in rusty ranks. Where the ditches had failed, whole fields lay drowned, the winter wheat rotting in an inch of brown glass, and beyond them the roofs of Netherfold village sat low and dark as a row of overturned boats. He stopped the gig on the rise and let her look. 1,100 acres, he said, 400 of it under water since Michaelmas. That is the Garrow fen. Down there is the mill at Netherfold that spins the wool of 8 parishes, and it has been standing idle since February because the leat silted up and there is no money to cut it out. 290 souls take their bread from that mill, another 60 from the drainage engine that has not turned since my father's time. He kept his eyes on the water. There it is. That is my wife's dowry to me and mine to her, not affection, that. And the money to mend it, she said slowly, comes with a wife. It comes with a wife. He made himself say the whole ugly shape of it. My father tied the Beckhold Trust, the whole liquid fortune of this house, near £90,000 behind a condition. The Duke of Garrow takes it upon his marriage, or upon his 35th birthday it passes entire to the next male of the blood. My cousin, Sir Julian Peveril. My birthday falls on the 9th of June. Sir Julian has already had a surveyor out to price the fen for sale as sporting water, and the mill for its stone. The wind came off the reeds and pushed at her bonnet. She reached up and held it without looking away from the drowned fields. "And your side of the contract to me," she said. "Your father's debts are paid as of 9 o'clock this morning, £11,400, and the mortgage on Ainsworth Hall discharged, and your Uncle Barnaby has been told in writing that his interest in you is at an end. Your sisters have 4,000 apiece settled irrevocably, which they will have whether you and I speak civilly to one another or never speak again. You have 300 a year in your own hand, unquestioned, and a carriage when you want one, and the whole of the north wing and my name." He paused. "And you are not required to love me or to pretend to. I will not ask it. I will not permit anyone else to ask it either." She was quiet so long that he turned to look at her. Her eyes were wet, but not, he thought, in the way he had feared. She was looking at the mill. "Your Grace," she said, "2 months ago my uncle brought a Mr. Rundle to dine. A wool merchant of 61, very rich, very fond of the sound of his own opinions. He had my uncle's leave to speak to me in the small parlor, and he explained to me kindly, as a man explains a matter to a horse, that a girl of 24 with no fortune and 2 sisters behind her has no business having a preference." Her mouth moved. "So you will forgive me if I do not weep over a marriage which comes to me as an account fairly stated, with my sisters' names in it before my own." Something turned over in his chest that he had no name for and no use for. He gathered the reins. "Then we understand one another." "Not yet," she said, "but we may." Garrow Hall received its new mistress in the manner of a house that had forgotten how. Fires in rooms that had been shut since his mother died. The long table laid for 2 at either end of 11 feet of mahogany, which he saw for the first time as an absurdity, and could not think how to mend on the first evening. Mrs. Tooks, the housekeeper, delivered the keys with an air of handing over a wounded animal. Alaric said what was proper, ate what was put before him, and retired to the library, where he sat with a decanter he did not touch, and listened to the strange sound of another person's door closing somewhere above him. The bolt, he noticed, was not drawn. He had listened for it without meaning to. He put out the lamp, disgusted with himself, and went to bed. The morning brought Sir Julian Peveril, who arrived before the breakfast things were cleared, and made a great business of kissing Cordelia's hand. "So this is she." Sir Julian had their grandfather's chin and none of his spine, and a coat cut too well for the country. "My dear cousin, I congratulate you on the most convenient courtship in the county. 8 days from the announcement to the altar. Even the fens do not flood that fast." "9," Alaric said. "You will find the register accurate." "Oh, the register." Sir Julian smiled at Cordelia. "Registers are accurate about everything except the truth, Duchess. My man of business has an opinion, you will not mind my being frank, that a marriage got up in a fortnight to defeat a testator's intention is a fraud upon the will, and that a fraud may be shown by its fruits, or the want of them. Separate apartments, for instance, separate tables, a wife who is never seen on her husband's arm." He drew on his gloves. "Chancery does love a detail." Alaric found that he had risen. "You will take your hat from my hall." "I will take my hat, cousin, and my leave, and I will see you in June." At the door Sir Julian turned. "For what it is worth, madam, I bear you no grudge whatever. You have been used, and you know it, and I think rather better of you than of him." The door closed. The clock in the hall ticked. Alaric stood with his hands flat on the sideboard and waited for his own blood to stop making that noise in his ears. "He is right about the detail," Cordelia said calmly, "and wrong about everything else. Sit down, your Grace, your coffee is going cold." He sat down. She poured, which no one had done for him in 11 years. "He will want witnesses," she said. "Servants, tradesmen, the parson, anyone who can say that the Duke and Duchess of Garrow have never once been observed to behave as though the marriage were real. So we shall have to be observed. I will not have you paraded." I did not say paraded, I said observed. She set down the pot. There is a difference, and it happens to suit me because I am extremely tired of rooms. You go out at 7 every morning. Mrs. Tukes told me, take me with you. He looked at her, across the 11 feet of mahogany. It is wet work, he said, and the men speak plainly, and there is nothing at Netherfold to see but ruin. Then there is a great deal for me to do. He had expected her to last a week. By the end of the first week, she had the names of every family in Netherfold and the ages of their sheep. By the end of the second, she had discovered that the mill accounts had been kept for 9 years by a bailiff who could not add, and she brought Alaric the ledgers herself, laid open, with 3 columns ruled fresh in her own hand, and the errors totted up at the bottom. £412 gone astray, not stolen, merely lost through incompetence into the cracks of the parish. My father was a bad manager of money, she said, and I was the eldest, so I learned to be a good one. It is not an accomplishment one may mention in a drawing-room. Mention it here, Alaric said, and heard how his own voice had roughened. Mention it as often as you like. She took the schoolroom next, the empty gatehouse where his mother had once taught the Fenman's daughters their letters, and which had stood shuttered 14 years, and had it swept and glazed and full of benches inside a month, and paid the glazier out of her own 300 a year without telling him, so that he only learned of it when the man came to thank him. That evening, he had the 11-foot table taken out of the small dining room, and a round one carried in from the steward's parlor in its place. Cordelia stopped in the doorway when she saw it. Sir Julian's detail, Alaric said, unable to look at her. Nothing more. Of course, she said, nothing more. They ate at 3 feet instead of 11, and he discovered that she had a dry way of describing people that made him laugh aloud for the first time in the memory of his own household. Mrs. Tukes, passing the door, dropped a spoon. The letters began in April, when Chancery business took him to London for 19 days. He had meant to write once, formally, on the matter of the leet. He wrote every second day, and she answered every one, and he learned to be at the breakfast table when the post came in. The ewes are through the worst of it, she wrote, though I have lost the argument about the lambing pens and been told by Nathaniel Croom that I am a woman and ought to be indoors, to which I replied that I was a duchess and ought to be obeyed, and we have agreed to consider the matter unsettled. The gatehouse has 9 scholars. One of them, Susan Pyle, can read better than her father and is pretending she cannot, so as not to shame him. I have never in my life wanted so much to be in 2 places at once. Your fen is a horrible country, and I find I am fond of it. Come home when you can. The mill wheel is to be turned by hand on Thursday for the first time, and it seems wrong that you should not see it. He read that letter 4 times, and on the 4th reading, he stopped at 3 words and sat very still in a rented room in Bruton Street, with the noise of the street coming up through the window. Come home when you can, not to Garrow, home. He had married her on a Tuesday in March to save a mill, and he had not once, in all his careful accounting of the bargain, considered what it would cost him if he came to love his wife. He came home on the Wednesday night, having ridden the last stage in the dark rather than sleep at Huntingdon, and he was at Netherfold at 7 the next morning with mud to his knees. They had rigged a capstan bar through the spokes of the great wheel, and 20 men and half the women of the village leaned on it. Cordelia was on the bar. She had her sleeves pinned back and her hair coming down, and the hem of the gray walking dress was beyond saving. And when the wheel groaned and gave and took its first quarter turn in 14 months, the shout that went up over the reed beds put birds off the water half a mile away. She saw him then. She did not let go of the bar. She only looked at him over her shoulder with her whole face alight, and Alaric, Duke of Garrow, who had faced down a bank in Threadneedle Street and a judge in Chancery, and his own father's coffin without a change of countenance, had to look away at the sluice gate and pretend to examine the hinges. "Your Grace," she said, arriving beside him, breathless, smelling of wet wool and iron, "you are 3 days early." The business concluded. It did not. She wiped her palm on her skirt. "Mr. Hallam's clerk wrote to me about the deeds, so I know precisely how much business is outstanding. You came early." "I came early," he said. That was all. It was a great deal. Through the last week of April and into May, they fell into a shape that neither of them named. He rode out at 7. She came, most days in a farm cart if the gig was wanted elsewhere, and thought nothing of it. She learned the fen the way she had learned the ledgers, which was to say completely and without fuss. She could name the 4 sluices between Netherfold and the river by the sound of the water going through them, and she was the one who noticed, on the 11th of May, that the sound at Wren's bank had changed. "It is lower," she said, "and faster. Listen." Alaric listened, and then he was running. The bank at Wren's had been made by his grandfather out of clay and hope, and the spring rains had been finding their way into it for a month. What Cordelia had heard was the river discovering a fault 2 feet under the water line and beginning, patiently, to widen it. By 4 in the afternoon, there was a scour the width of a door. By 6, the fen wind had got up out of the northeast, and the sky over Netherfold had gone the color of a bruise. He sent for every man in the 8 parishes. They came with hurdles and sacks and stakes and their sons, and they worked in the rain from 6 until well past midnight, driving hurdles into the breach and stuffing them with reed and clay, while the water shoved back at them like a live thing. Alaric was in the water to his chest for the better part of 3 hours. Twice he came up onto the bank, and found, at the top of the lantern light, a woman in a soaked cloak organizing a line of girls handing sacks down the bank in relay, and a fire going, and a great kettle over it, and the news, passed along from hand to hand, that the Duchess had sent the gig back for blankets, and had emptied the hall's linen press to get them. At 1:30 the breach held. At 2, the men began to sit down where they stood. He found her at the fire. She had a boy of 17 wrapped in a horse blanket and was making him drink something scalding, and her hands were shaking so badly she had to hold the cup in both of them. When she had finished with the boy, she turned round and looked at Alaric for a long moment and said, quite conversationally, "You went under. At the 2nd hurdle. I saw you go under and I could not do anything at all about it. The water is only 5 feet at the—" "Do not," she said, "tell me about the water." And then she put her forehead against the wet wool of his shoulder, briefly, the way a person leans on a doorframe, and stepped back before he could decide what to do with his hands. He carried the memory of that half-second home in the cart and up the stairs, and it kept him awake until the light came. In the morning she had a fever. It was not the terrible kind. Dr. Olorenshaw came out from Ely, pronounced it a chill upon the lungs, prescribed patience, and observed that the Duchess had stood 8 hours in a May rain, which no constitution enjoys. For 6 days Alaric ran the estate with half his mind, and spent the other half in a chair on the landing outside the Green Suite, where he could hear the maid come and go, and where he did not once put his hand on the door. On the 4th evening, she called out that she could hear him pacing, and that he might as well come in and be useful. And he sat by the window with the door standing wide open behind him, and read to her out of a dull book about the drainage of the Dutch polders. And she fell asleep in the middle of a paragraph about windmills with a faint frown, as though the polders had disappointed her. He sat there another hour after she slept. He told himself it was to see the fire made up. She was down on the 8th day, thinner and furious about the schoolroom, which had gone unopened. He had the gatehouse fires lit before she asked. The county's invitation came at the end of May, and he very nearly refused it. The Netherby Assembly was the fixed star of the neighborhood's year, and Alaric had not attended one in 6 years. But Cordelia set the card against the candlestick at breakfast and looked at it the way she looked at a bad column of figures. "Sir Julian will be there," she said, "which is reason enough to stay away." "It is the only reason to go." She turned the card over. "Your Grace Chancery will hear his petition in a fortnight. Every soul in that room will be asked, sooner or later by somebody's attorney, what they observed of us. At present what they have observed is nothing whatever, and nothing whatever is exactly the case Sir Julian intends to make." She set the card down. "I am not afraid of them. I have been looked at before. But I will not go in a made-over gown and give them the pleasure, and I have not the sort of dress that room expects, and I will not spend your money on one, so there we are." He said, "You have 300 a year of your own, and you spent it on window glass." She flushed. "Who told you that?" "The glazier, who thought he was thanking me." He folded his napkin. "Wear what you please, but you will oblige me by receiving one thing that is not out of my banker and not out of yours." His mother's pearls came out of the strong room that afternoon, 3 strands, and a clasp of old paste-set silver, worn thin at the hasp from being touched. He put the case on the table in front of her, and stood back from it with his hands behind him. "She wore these at her own assembly the year she married," he said. "She had no fortune either. My father was told he had married beneath his consequence, and he answered, I heard him say it, I was 7, that consequence was a thing a man carried in himself and could not receive from a wife, and that he would be obliged if the subject were dropped." His jaw tightened. "He was a hard man and a poor father, and he tied up his money to make a fool of me from the grave. But he was right that once, and he loved her, and I am tired of the whole county believing that this house has no warmth in it." Cordelia touched the pearls without lifting them. "This is not the contract," she said. "No," Alaric said, "it is not." She wore the gray silk she had brought from Ainsworth, and the 3 strands of pearls, and she went into the Netherby Assembly rooms on his arm, and Alaric found that he had never in his life so much enjoyed being stared at. They were, of course, stared at. Lady Crewkerne raised her glass to look at the Mendied cuff, and Miss Sowerby of Grantham told 2 other young ladies behind her fan, at a carrying volume, that £11,000 was a very handsome price for a girl with a country accent, and the whole long room turned its head to see how the Duke of Garrow would take it. He took it by handing his wife into the first set. He had not danced since his mother's funeral. He danced 4. Between the second and the third he stood with Cordelia at the end of the room by the great window, and answered Lady Crewkerne's inquiry about the fen with a full quarter-hour on the subject of the Netherfold Mill, the wages of 290 persons, and the precise achievements of the Duchess of Garrow in the matter of the parish accounts, delivered in a voice pitched to carry to the punch table. £412, he said, which she found in a fortnight, and which no man in my employment had found in 9 years. You will forgive me, ma'am. I find I would rather speak of that than of dressmakers." Lady Crewkerne, who was a shrewd old woman under the glass, looked from him to Cordelia and back, and said, "Well," in a tone of considerable satisfaction, and afterwards told everyone within reach that the Garrow marriage was the one genuine thing she had seen at Netherby in 20 years. It was at the beginning of the 4th dance, with his wife's hand in his and the candles doubling themselves in the window glass, that Alaric looked across the room and saw Sir Julian Peveril standing in the doorway with a folded paper in his hand, and a man in a black coat behind him. The citation was served in the card room, correctly, quietly, with 3 magistrates as witnesses. "Chancery, the 18th of June," Sir Julian said. "You will observe I have not made a scene of it. I would not spoil the lady's evening for the world." He held out a second paper, and his voice, for the first time in Alaric's memory of him, held something like real triumph. "And this is the schedule of documents. You had better read it in the carriage, cousin. Item 9 will interest you." Alaric read it in the carriage, by the flame of the coach lamp, with the fens going by black on either side. Item 9. Articles of Agreement, dated the 2nd day of March, executed between His Grace the Duke of Garrow and Mr. Barnaby Ainsworth, uncle and guardian of Miss Cordelia Ainsworth. Produced by Mr. Ainsworth. He had drafted those articles himself, in his own hand, at his own desk, in a cold rage against a wool merchant of 61. There were 11 clauses. He knew every one of them by heart, and the 7th had seemed to him, in March, the plainest kindness he had it in his power to offer a woman being sold. He folded the schedule very slowly and looked up. Cordelia was watching him across the dark of the carriage, with the pearls at her throat catching the lamp. "Item 9, she said. "Your uncle kept a copy," Alaric said. "He has sold it to my cousin. It will be read aloud in open court, and in it there is a clause, in my hand and over my signature, which provides that this marriage shall be understood to create no claim whatever of affection upon either party." His voice went out from under him. "Cordelia, in 11 days a barrister is going to stand up in Lincoln's Inn and prove out of my own writing that I do not love my wife." Cordelia did not answer him at once. The carriage went over the causeway, and the wheels changed their note on the stone, and she reached across the dark and took his hand, took it, closed both of hers around it, and held on. "Then let them read it," she said, "and afterwards you will stand up and tell them what has become true since March. That is all any of it requires. It requires a court to believe a duke about his own heart." "It requires you to say it," she said, "which is a different difficulty and a much greater one, and I have observed that you would rather stand in 5 feet of flood water." They were 11 days getting ready. Mr. Hallam came from London with 2 clerks and slept in the Blue Room and ate at odd hours. Depositions were taken in the steward's parlor. Mrs. Tooks, who declared with her chin up that the Duchess had emptied the linen press with her own hands, and that she had never in 11 years heard His Grace laugh at table until this spring. Nathaniel Croom, who said the Duchess was a woman and ought to be indoors, and that if any London gentleman wished to argue about the lambing pens, he might come to Netherfold and try it. Susan Pyle's father, who said, painfully, in front of 3 clerks, that he had learned his own letters at the age of 41 at the gatehouse in the evenings, because the Duchess had offered, quietly, to teach him, and had told no one. Alaric read the deposition twice, and had to leave the room. The Court of Chancery on the 18th of June was hot, brown, and full of men in wigs, and Sir Julian Peveril's counsel was a Mr. Vokes with a beautiful voice, who spent 40 minutes establishing that the marriage had been solemnized 9 days after the announcement, 12 weeks before a birthday upon which £90,000 turned, and that the parties had occupied separate apartments from the wedding night onward. Then he called for item 9. Alaric sat and listened to his own handwriting read out into that brown air. "Clause the 7th, said Mr. Vokes, savoring it. "It is agreed and declared between the parties that the said marriage is a settlement of accounts and not a match of the affections, and that it shall create no claim whatsoever of affection, courtship, or attendance upon either party, and that the said Miss Ainsworth shall be free of any such expectation from the day of the ceremony onward. He lowered the paper. In the Duke's own hand, my lord, over the Duke's own signature. I do not believe the plaintiff need call a single further witness as to the character of this union. There was a rustle along the benches. Barnaby Ainsworth, in a new coat at the back of the court, looked pleased with himself for perhaps 3 more minutes. Mr. Hallam rose and asked, mildly, whether the Duke might be examined upon the document. Alaric took the stand. He had prepared a paper of remarks. He got as far as the second sentence, looked once at his wife sitting straight-backed in gray silk with 3 strands of pearls, and put the paper down on the ledge. "My lord," he said, "the clause is mine, every word. The court will not get a syllable of denial out of me, and I am not going to insult it by trying." He set his hands on the rail. But it may assist the court to know why it was written. On the 28th of February, a gentleman of 61 was given leave, by the man sitting at the back of this room, to speak to a woman of 24 in a small parlor, and he informed her there that a girl with no fortune has no business having a preference. She had no father living. She had 2 sisters and 11,000 pounds of debt, and no more power in the matter than a parcel has. I could pay the debt. I could not give her power. So I did the only thing that occurred to me, which was to put her freedom into writing, and to sign it, and to bind myself by it. That she should owe me nothing, that she should not be required to smile at me, or wait for me, or come when I called, and that if she chose never to speak to me twice in a year, the money should still be hers and her sister's, and no court on earth could take it back. That is what clause the 7th is. My learned friend has read it to you as a confession of coldness. It is a release. It is the only wedding gift I had that was worth anything. As to the separate apartments, they are separate at my insistence and not at hers, and the key to them is on the inside of the door, and it was I who put it there on the wedding morning, and told the household that no one would cross that threshold without her leave. If the plaintiff wishes to make an argument out of a locked door, my lord, let him make it. I would do the same again tomorrow. Mr. Vokes was on his feet. The witness is making a speech. Then let him finish it, said the master, without looking up from his notes, since it is at least a speech about the point. Alaric turned to the bench. My lord, the plaintiff's case is that this marriage was a fraud because it began as a bargain. I do not dispute how it began. I dispute what it is. On the 11th of May, the bank at Rennes went out, and 400 acres, and a village lay under it, and my wife stood 8 hours in the rain at the top of that bank passing sacks, and emptied my house of blankets without asking me, and afterwards took a fever that kept her a week in her bed. She had no interest in that fen. Under clause the 7th she had no duty to it, or to me. She went because the people of Netherfold had come to be hers. She found £412 in the parish accounts in a fortnight. She has 9 scholars in a schoolroom that had been shut 14 years, and she glazed its windows out of her own pin money and hid the bill from me. She taught a grown man his letters in the evenings and told nobody, and I learned it from a deposition 8 days ago and could not read it twice. His voice did at last go unsteady, and he let it. My lord, I wrote that clause in March to protect a stranger. I have to tell the court that I cannot any longer be held to it, because in March I did not love my wife, and I do now, entirely, and there is not a court in England with the power to make that untrue by reading my own bad handwriting back to me. I ask leave to have the clause struck out, not because it was dishonorable, because it has been overtaken. The court was quite silent. Somewhere behind him, a woman on the public benches blew her nose. Then Mr. Hallam said, My lord, with the court's permission, the Duchess of Garrow is here, and is willing. Cordelia was sworn. She answered 8 questions in a clear, unhurried voice, and the 8th was Mr. Vokes's, and it was a mistake. "Madam, you cannot deny that you married for £11,000. "I married for £11,000, she said, "and for 4,000 each to my sisters, and I would do it again this afternoon, and I am not ashamed of a single figure of it. I was not asked whether I loved him. I was asked whether I would be sold to a stranger for his convenience, or married by a man who wrote out my freedom before he wrote out his own name." She looked at the bench. "My lord, on the wedding morning he told me to take off the wedding dress. It was the kindest thing anybody had said to me in a year. He meant that he would not have me standing before him dressed as a bride, while the thing between us was only paper. He meant that he was not going to pretend. Everything I know about my husband is in that sentence, and if the court wants to know what has grown out of it, the court has only to come and stand on Wren's bank and ask the 8 parishes." The master of the rolls found for the defendant in 14 minutes, observing that a marriage lawfully solemnized is not void because it was prudent, that the testator had required a wife and not a romance, and that in his considerable experience of chancery, it was not every day that the court had the benefit of hearing a great deal too much truth from both sides at once. He struck Clause 7 by consent. He also observed, dryly, that Mr. Barnaby Ainsworth's conduct in selling a private article respecting his own niece was a matter upon which the court would say nothing further, since anything it said would be in the newspapers by Friday. It was, and Barnaby Ainsworth left the county before Michaelmas, and the wool merchant of 61 was not asked to dine anywhere in 3 parishes again. Sir Julian Peveril paid the costs, and sold his own hunters to do it, and had the grace, some years later, to accept an invitation to Garrow at Christmas, where he was polite to the Duchess and unbearable about the port, and where he told anyone who would listen that he had always maintained his cousin's marriage was the genuine article. The Beckhold Trust was paid over on the 21st of June. The lead at Netherfold was cut out by August, 400 yards of it, 40 men on the works. The drainage engine turned for the first time on the 9th of September, and the water on the fen began to go down an inch a week, and by the following spring there was wheat standing green on ground that had been under brown glass when Cordelia Ainsworth first looked at it in a bonnet she had to hold on with her hand. The mill spun the wool of 8 parishes. Susan Pyle, who could read better than her father, was in due course the schoolmistress of a school with a stone over the door and no name on it, because the Duchess had refused a name. And on a Tuesday in March, a year to the day from the chapel bells, Alaric Ravensworth, Duke of Garrow, came and stood in the doorway of the Green Suite, where the key was still on the inside and had never once been turned. "Madam," he said, "I have a request, and I make it badly as I do everything." Cordelia looked up from the lambing book. "You always make it badly. Go on." "Put on the wedding dress." She went still. "The parson is in the chapel," Alaric said, "and the household is in the chapel, and Mrs. Tewkes has been crying since 10 o'clock this morning and will not say why, though the whole house knows. There is nothing legal in it. We are married. No court in England will let us out of it now. I have the paper to prove I tried." He stopped. He came the 2 steps into the room and took her hand, which he had learned to do somewhere in the last 12 months without deciding to. "But a year ago I asked you to take that dress off because I could not offer you the thing it stood for. I can offer it now. I have been able to offer it since the 11th of May, and I have been slow about saying so, and I would like, if you are willing, Cordelia, to say the whole of it once, out loud, in the place where I said none of it at all." She was on her feet. The lambing book went on the floor, and neither of them picked it up. "Half an hour," she said. "Your Grace, I have kept it in the press." She came down the great stair in 26 minutes, in ivory silk cut down from her mother's gown, with 3 strands of old pearls at her throat and no grain of rice anywhere about her. And the whole of Garrow rose to its feet in a chapel full of March light. Afterwards, when the household had gone into the round table that had replaced the long one, Alaric stood with his wife in the doorway of the chapel with her hand inside his arm, and looked out over the fen, where the water lay flat and silver, and going down, and found that he could not think of a single thing to say that had not already been said in open court, in front of a great many strangers. "You are quiet," Cordelia said. "There is a want of business," he said. "I find I have nothing left to arrange." She laughed and leaned her head against his shoulder. Not briefly this time, not the way a person leans on a doorframe, but the way a woman comes home. And the Duke of Garrow put his hand over hers and stood in the wind off the reeds and let himself be, for the first time in his life, entirely at leisure to be loved.